Are you curious about Zero Trust architecture? Looking for ways to practically implement it? This video is for you. So at this point, you may have heard of Zero Trust architecture, but you're not quite sure what it is. And I can kind of sum it up pretty quickly. It's effectively trusting nothing. Now you might have heard trust but verify, but that's broken. And why? Why should there be trust, period? That obviously hasn't worked for organizations. You see about breaches, you hear about them all the time. In fact, we've become numb to them all. So this concept of Zero Trust architecture is really started to gain some ground, not really from an implementation standpoint, but from a discussion. Vendors are starting to use it. Forrester created the topic, thankfully. It's a really interesting concept, but it needs to be more than a concept. And right now it's predominantly a concept. It's the concept of let's not trust anything. Anything that's going to make a connection needs to be verified. Any data access needs to be verified. And today in the digital world, that is fully doable, but the way these type of controls are implemented are not. Instead, we still live in the day of perimeter protection. This is, you have firewalls at the edge. You have VPN access to get inside. But once someone's inside, they're trusted. Maybe you have an IDS, a network security monitor. But again, once you're on the inside, from internal to internal, there's a lack of visibility, there's a lack of prevention, it's just trusted. So Zero Trust is really changing this in that effectively the perimeter doesn't matter. Everything must be verified, everything must be inspected, and this is doable. Some practical ways of implementing, or some practical steps to implementing Zero Trust, is to start off with full verification. For example, today, if you have two systems talking internally, it's typically one authenticates to the other. It's not bi-directional authentication. It's not mutual authentication. And that is actually something that is really easy to implement. With Windows, we have IPsec. With anything that supports TLS, there's mutual TLS. I am actually going to show these later in this video of actual implementations using this because it's not that difficult. So one thing you can do to truly verify everything is implement bidirectional authentication or encryption. If we don't trust anything, then all connections should be encrypted, endpoint to endpoint. And again, those come with things like IPsec and TLS. There's also the concept of everything has to be monitored now. Because if you think about it, if we're going to truly think that systems might have already been compromised, the adversary could be on our network at any point, that means you need to be looking for them. And this is one area where the industry has actually started to slowly trend. Detection is right now really hip, it's cool, it's sexy. There's a lot of detection techniques. I've got a lot of webcasts on the SANS archive specific to blue team detection, yet organizations are still behind the curve here. So what am I talking here? We need things like network security monitoring solutions that are tuned also to see internal to internal. That's a big one. A lot of organizations are missing that. We need SIM solutions that are collecting logs that actually matter and help us do detection. And we need to gear those to actually look for adversarial or dynamic change in an environment, an abnormality, without getting too many false positives. Now, that's a tricky one as well. A really big thing, though, to me with Zero Trust 2, though, is that things are no longer binary. They're no longer yes, no. For example, if I'm on the network, I authenticate, I connect to a box, I have access, I do something bad, I have a virus or something, a lot of times how that's treated is, oh my gosh, bad, stomp, off the network, denied access, quarantine, whatever. And again, I understand that, but there's a different way to do this. So some of the approaches to Zero Trust architecture, they call out what's called variable trust. And this might seem a little bleeding edge, but again, technology today is there that allows this. In fact, the last demo I'm going to show in this video is me implementing variable trust with all the stuff I have at home, which is predominantly free stuff. In fact, the only thing that's not free is I have a FortiGate next-gen firewall. It cost me like $600. But even then, I could have implemented this with an open source firewall. Again, you'll see that at the end of the video. But variable trust is the concept of trust is acquired and changes over time. It's not a flat line. It's like an ocean. It flows. And based on what is happening between a user and a device pair, the identity, your trust varies. It's that concept of I will verify everything to the extreme. So for example, let's say normally I have X number of applications open, I log in so many times a day between these set periods of time, whatever. But now today, maybe I've got a lot of uploading going on for some reason. That might make my trust level go down because it's not normal for me. That doesn't mean, oh my gosh, bad, no access. But it might mean that if I'm accessing a critical app, maybe something that has access to patient healthcare data, credit cards, whatever, that I'm going to have to re-authenticate or use multi-factor authentication because my trust is a little lower than normal and we just want to add some additional verification steps in there. It could also be the opposite, where I'm such a picture-perfect employee and that my risk is extremely low that maybe some of those constraints get lifted for good behavior. It can go both ways. But the key thing here is it's controlled and it's variable. It's variable, okay? Again, I'm going to show a demo at the end of this on how actually can be implemented, and I'll have some scripts on there. A book on this that I really like, Zero Trust Architecture. I don't remember the author's name, but I'll put the notes in YouTube. It's a very good read, and again, it talks about some of these concepts of variable trust, mutual authentication. You know, if the adversary is on your network, how we can do this. Single packet authorization. It's all in there. It's a really good book. But it also makes emphasis that a lot of this seems bleeding edge, like companies aren't ready for it. And I want to tell you, the technology is already there. Zero Trust at its core is a strategy. It's an implementation guide on how you use what you have. Again, network security monitoring, that's one of my favorite tools. It's one of my bread and butters. I love it. SecuredYoungin, shout out. That's awesome. SecuredYoungin is one of the few tools I know of that the default configuration is actually, external net. No. It's anything. In an IDS, there's this variable called external net, which is typically a non-private IP, a non-RFC 1918 IP. Because it's looking for inbound, outbound evilness. But a solid network security monitoring solution is tuned to also look for internal. Because you can catch a lot of stuff with actually higher fidelity and lower false positives if you know your environment. And even if you don't know your environment, the tools that do this level of prevention or detection easily can generate reports to get you those answers. So, with that, I want to go into some of the demos to show you where this can actually take practical application and some of the benefits of trying to implement Zero Trust architecture.
Alright, enough talk. It's time to see this in action. So, what would Zero Trust architecture look like if it was applied on your network? And how hard would it be to configure? I'm going to go through a few demos. Some of them I'll show you some of the behind the scenes. Some I'm just going to talk about that have already been set up. But I've got a few demos to show you. So first off, I want to just talk about like a web server. So I've got an IIS-10 box ready. We're going to connect to it, see what it looks like normally, and then see how you can tweak it for a Zero Trust model and see how that affects things. So okay, first let's reach out and access the site as normal. So here we go. Alright, so I'm on a box called HRO1 and I'm going to browse over to wasus.labmeinc.internal. It's just a web server running on port 443 with an SSL certificate. And as you can see, the page loads. This is a test page, that's all I need you to see. If I was an unauthorized asset, say I brought a system in, plugged it into your network on the same subnet as say the HR desktops, very likely I could reach over and connect to this web server. even though I'm on a untrusted device. Because once we're on the inside of the network, it's typically trusted. All right, how can we change that, and how much does this affect things? Before we make changes, I want to do a real quick port scan to see what can we see so far. So I'm switching to a Kali box, simulating that I'm on your network. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to port scan this box. So we're going to port scan 443, and we're going to do a little bit of fingerprinting and see what we get. So whatsus.labmeinc.internal, and we'll let that run. This will take just a second. So okay. And when this finishes, we're going to see what kind of information we can see today versus what we can see after we make a simple setting change. There we go. So, looking at the results, we can see that 443 is open. It prints out some of the SSL related certificate information, and it also shows the HTTP options enabled by the IIS server, as well as the prediction for the operating system. So, was able to connect and was able to pull some information. If I were to do a web scanning tool such as Burp Suite, I could go even deeper. Now, I'm not going to kick this off because it takes a little bit, but I've pre-saved a Burp scan. Burp is a web application scanner. So real quick, I want to do a real quick compare, show what you can see normally versus what we're going to see after I make a simple change. So I'm going to load up Burp Suite. And by the way, what I'm getting ready to load, I've also saved out on the GitHub site on the notes of the YouTube video. You'll be able to access that, so you can open these and do a compare and contrast yourself. So just follow along for right now, though. So I'm going to open an existing project, and I'm going to browse out to web server TLS results. What does this look like with a traditional TLS connection, which is HTTPS connection? And next, start it up. Alright, so as you can see, I was able to scan the site. Burp Suite was able to access multiple pages, and under those pages, it ran multiple tests because it was able to connect and do these kind of scans. Under the scanner tab, you can see it pulls SSL certificates there. It could see that I didn't have HSTS enforced, as well as other potential items the scanner picked up. Nothing of really super interest, but it's the fact that an unauthorized asset, because I did this on that Kali box, can be plugged in and reached over to a company-controlled asset, and it just works. We want to change that behavior. Okay, so now it's time to make a change to see what the impact is here. What I'm going to do, this first thing I'm going to recommend, is mutual TLS. So many applications support encryption, usually in the form of TLS. It's not always, but web servers are very common. Email systems, a lot of things use TLS. One of the options you have to enforce a zero trust model is to force mutual TLS. Typically, when we connect to a web server, the web server certificate has to be trusted, but the client doesn't matter. Mutual TLS means the client has to trust the server, and the server has to trust the client. And this gets a little bit more complicated. I'm not going to go that deep into it, but as far as enabling it, it's pretty easy. So I'm going to go to this IIS server, change the setting, and then we're going to redo the port scan, and I'm going to show you another web scan so you can see what the impact of that change was. So here we go. I'm going to switch over to the web server. In this case, it's IIS 10. I'm going to click on the website, and then under SSL settings, this defaults to required SSL, might be checked, might not. If you force SSL, that's checked, so that's not a big deal. The setting that matters here is that we're now checking require client certificate. So, all right, we'll click require, apply. That's it. Now, in order to connect to this website, a client system has to have a certificate the server trust is. Now, the implications of that there's quite a bit to it. Typically, you need to have a full-blown PKI, public key infrastructure system deployed. Highly recommend Windows because it can auto-enroll your clients and users, and it's free. But that's outside the scope of this video. But if you have that in place, clients already have certificates, and now watch what happens when a user reaches over to this website. So I'm going to switch back to HR01. I'm going to refresh the page, and notice it pops up and says, which client certificate would you like to use? In this case, I only have one. I'm going to hit OK. Site loads. That's great. If I do the same thing on the unauthorized asset, it's not going to work. I don't have a client certificate that the server trusts on this unauthorized asset. So I reach over. There we go. wasus.labmeinc.internal. Doesn't trust the internal certification. That's fine. Go through, and page doesn't load. Page doesn't load because the site requires a certificate, and this box doesn't even have a client certificate, period, so there's no pop-up asking. Now, in a production environment, this is fantastic because now a company-controlled asset that has a certificate can connect. And if you're thinking, well, what about that annoying pop-up? That's actually really easy to fix. I'll show you this real quick. So I'm jumping on a domain controller. I'm going under group policy. I've got one called Google Chrome Certificate Auto Select. Same concept works for Internet Explorer and Firefox. Basically, you push out a setting change to all your systems, and it tells it which client certificates to automatically apply to which sites. So in my case here, I'm automatically applying internal certificates from my LabMe Inc. PKI CA certificate authority to any website that is from labmeinc.internal. So if I turn this group policy back on, do a GP update, now that HR01 box, when it reaches out to the web server, it won't even ask. It'll just load the page. No one even knows you enabled mutual TLS. So it's not that big of a deal. Okay, but the implications from an attacker perspective and how the zero trust by forcing two-way authentication, how that differs is significant. So let's go back to our scan we did. I'm going to repeat this. And again, notice all the information you have here, and it's going to change. Now, on the port scan, it's not going to change that dramatically because all we're doing is a simple port scan. On the burp suite, it's going to change significantly, and I'll show that in a second. Let's first let this scan finish. So just one moment. All right, scan just completed. Let's take a look at this. It looks pretty similar, but it's actually not the same. So we still see 443s open because we're forcing mutual TLS, which means we still can allow that initial SYN packet to work. So 443's open. It still can pull the certificate information because it starts negotiating the SSL TLS handshake. So it can see the server certificate. It's just failing on the client certificate negotiation. Okay, so in here though, if you look real closely, you'll notice it no longer has the title of the site, and it no longer has that the trace verb or the HTTP option was enabled. So this means it can't connect all the way. It can't finish the connection to start pulling information about the web server. So already from a simple port scan, we're seeing some differences. Now, what about someone using a web scanner or a vulnerability scanner or an automatic exploit tool? Well, for that, again, I'm going to open up Burp Suite and we're going to load another project here. Again, this is in the link of the YouTube video. You can pull this up and see for yourself. So this time I'm going to load the web server mutual TLS results. So once mutual TLS was enforced, what did the scan look like? And again, remember all these different issues and different pages were able to be scanned before. Now when I load this up, there we go. Oh, let me close that out so we have a fresh one real quick. There we go. Burp. Open existing project, choose file, mutual TLS. Here we go. All right. Now, in here, you'll already notice under the sitemap, there's nothing listed. There's nothing listed because the sitemap only adds an entry once a page has been connected to. And with mutual TLS, the unauthorized asset couldn't fully complete a web page request. Therefore, nothing added into the site index at all. Okay, but I was able to rig it a little bit that I could try to get at least some information. So we can skip over to the scanner, and you can see it tried to hit the main page. It did try to load different things, but the only thing it could pull was the SSL certificate of the server, and that HSTS was not in the header. So much less information because it never could complete a web request fully. So already just mutual TLS is a really cool and quick whiz-bang way of implementing part of the Zero Trust strategy. So highly recommend that. Another thing we can do for Zero Trust is we can implement domain isolation. So instead of using something like TLS, we can use something like in Windows. Windows actually has a special integration with IPsec or IP security that allows connections to be authenticated, mutual authentication, with optional encryption, both of which we would want. So if you want to take this concept of TLS to the extreme, you could also do so using IPsec. So again, just kind of let's do the same asset again. This was sus.labmeinc.internal. I'm going to do a ping. I want you to see what it looks like normally versus after the change. So here we go. On this box, ping was sus.labmeinc.internal. The ping works. Again, if this was plugged into the HR subnet and I'm on that subnet, very likely if pings weren't allowed from an HR desktop for some reason, this is going to work even though it's an unauthorized asset. Okay, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on IPsec, and it's going to change things quite a bit. For this, I have a group policy that I've already created. You can see here, I'll just scroll through this real quick. The key is this Windows Firewall section. I've turned on IPsec rules. I've got some exceptions for like the gateway, the vulnerability scanner, which is on a Linux box because it doesn't support IPsec natively, and just some of the rules, the certificates I'm trusting. So, okay, I'm going to enable this policy, link enable. I'm going to go to the WSUS server, and I'm going to force a GP update. I'm also going to do that on the HR01 system. And then while this is going, I want to get Wireshark running. So let's get a capture going. Because this is a virtual machine, I just want to make sure the capture is limited to this host. Otherwise, it'll see the other virtual machines I've got running, and I've got quite a few. So, okay, there we go. So, see this going in. See how the group policy update's going. Ping with sus. There we go. So the policy hasn't taken full effect yet because this is not. You'll notice here I can still see ICMP traffic coming across. It's clear text. I can see the payload information. So the IPsec rule hasn't yet kicked in. I'm going to kick off another GP update, and if that doesn't work, I'll reboot real quick. go ahead and limit this search to 10.02.50, which is the HR system for a second. And there we go. So now you'll notice this is switched over, and when I'm doing the pings are still working, but it's no longer ICMP traffic. It's now encapsulated inside of IPsec headers using ESP, and we'll also see some of these isocamps. So okay, I'm going to clear this just to prove that I'm not lying to you. So we'll restart this, continue without saving, and let's do another ping. There we go. No ICMP traffic at all, just ESP. And in my policy, I've tuned it that encryption is enabled, because by default, authentication would be enabled, but encryption wouldn't. I've got both. And you can prove that by looking at the payloads down here below. You cannot see what's in the ICMP packet. You can't even tell that this is ICMP traffic. Now, what would this look like coming from the unauthorized asset? Now, before I kick off this test against the unauthorized asset, I want to update and start over the packet capture so I'm only seeing traffic from the unauthorized asset. So I'm going to start the packet capture over, and I'm going to limit this to anything that's dealing with 192.168.2.39, which is the unauthorized asset. So switch over to the unauthorized Kali system, and again, I'm going to ping wasus.labmeinc.internal, and nothing. Where previously this worked. So I'm not getting anything because IPsec is immediately, it's going to kick in, it's going to force, hey, you have to try to authenticate to me. And this is not happening from the authorized asset. So to the unauthorized system, it thinks that that wasus server doesn't exist. It's offline. The firewall is blocking it. It's not getting any response. Proving this, go back to the packet capture. We see the ping request coming in to the wasus system, but it never responds at all. So this is kind of zero trust applied, very deeply ingrained. So again, Windows IPsec is what I'm using here. It's fantastic. Outside the scope, going into the details, maybe in the future I'll create a video showing how to set this up. Microsoft has some awesome documents. I'll add a link to the domain isolation model down below in the YouTube video. It is fantastic. Highly recommend you check it out. You do have to do this with caution. You cannot enable Windows IPsec to everything. Otherwise, you're going to have a chicken and egg problem. You can't force IPsec authentication if authentication is not allowed. For example, you have to be able to get an IP address from DHCP. You have to be able to reach a domain controller for authentication, period. Especially if, depending on how you're doing the IPsec authentication. Is it Kerberos? Is it certificates? Is it both? Is it computer? Is it user? You can get pretty granular, which is awesome. But you have to do this with caution. And there's great ways to implement this, strategic ways to not hose your environment. And if you need help, H&A does this. This is something I love. I like to recommend and see clients using this. So, okay, so that's one. Now, let's move on to kind of the last demo I want to show for Zero Trust. So these last couple demos have been more of what can I enable so that an untrusted asset can't do something on my environment. And that's great, and that is part of Zero Trust. But Zero Trust should also be less binary. Shouldn't just be yes, no, you have access, you don't have access. It should also be your machine's on my network, it's a corporate asset, it's a trusted asset, but I don't trust it. Meaning I'm going to monitor it heavily, and if it deviates from norm, I'm not going to just throttle it and beat it to death. Instead, I'm going to change its level of access or implement additional hurdles based on a variable trust system. So it's not just access, no access. It's more of, depending on the suspiciousness, the abnormalities shown by this machine, I may want to do something like pop up a box and make you re-authenticate even though you're already authenticated and single sign-on's working. It's maybe you can only access authorized sites. So I want to show you a direct application of this on this environment. So let's switch over to that. I'm going to shut down. We don't need the bus systems anymore, so let's stop this for right now. So for this last piece, I've got a few moving components. So I've got a Windows box that we're going to exhibit anywhere from normal to abnormal behaviors at differing degrees. I've got a FortiGate Fortinet firewall that traffic has to go through that I'm going to use to dynamically change how that asset is controlled. I've got a SIM running the Elastic Stack behind the scenes that I've got a bunch of data in. I've got NetFlow, I've got IDS alerts, I've got Windows logs, I've got all sorts of data in there. Because again, Zero Trust highly relies on significant levels of monitoring. You have to monitor your network so that you can adapt and change when you see abnormal behavior. So I've got that going on. And then I also have a PowerShell script that links in the video that I'm running that's constantly querying, looking for certain things that happen. And if it does, it's changing the FortiGate firewall dynamically. So it's implementing variable trust via the PowerShell script. So this will make a lot more sense as I show this to you. So let's just dive in. So I'm going to switch over to IT03. And on here, I've got a PowerShell script that I'm just using to emulate some suspicious behaviors. The one I'm going to use is clearing event logs, because this really shouldn't happen because Windows logs rotate. So on a desktop, if you see logs being cleared, a lot of times this can be like malware trying to hide its tracks. So I'm going to go ahead and issue that. So I've got logs being cleared. And then I've got this PowerShell script that I'm also going to run. And it runs every 10 seconds. You can change it. You probably would want it to run like every minute, every 15 minutes, whatever. And it's querying, in this case, an Elastic Stack system looking for key alerts. And if those alerts are seen, it's going to connect over into the FortiGate firewall and change that asset. Basically, it's going to change some address groups that it's in. So here we go. We'll wait a second, and we should see the script see the alert and then modify the FortiGate. In fact, there it is right there. So it saw 2.27, which is IT03. It removed it from the normal assets address group and added it to the low assets address group. All right, so if I were to show this to you, here's the FortiGate firewall. I've got 3 address groups that I'm emulating variable trust with: low, normal, high. Well, normal, low, high. In production, you could have medium. You could have all sorts of different levels here. So you can see 2.27 was originally normal, but it's now in low. And this is kind of cool because now if I jump on IT03, it previously could reach directly out to the internet, and it still can. But what I've implemented is this. Ignore the certificate error. I didn't fix that yet. Boom. Voila. You can still get to the internet, but now it pops up a little page. In production, this could ask for reauthentication. It could ask for whatever. In this case, I'm saying, I've seen some unusual behavior. I just want to verify effectively that you're a human. Click yes to continue, and now you have internet access again. Full internet access. Under Zero Trust Variable Trust, you set what happens when unusual behavior is seen. This could be initially, you still have internet access, maybe it's not going to pop even a page, but maybe nothing really happens. Or only when you access critical systems with lots of sensitive data, it might just ask you to re-authenticate. It's not changing your level of access, it's basically invoking a manual behavior to prove you are who you are again. This can be whatever. Again, in this, I just popped a terms and conditions page, customized it, and then if they click yes, they have access again. Going back to the PowerShell script, you see, in this case, I've got it running so frequently, it's already seen that the abnormality's gone, the alert's been disappeared for, in this case, a minute. And it moved it from low back to normal, which means I could access the internet directly without hitting that terms and conditions page again. I'm going to go ahead and do this again. This time I'm going to clear the logs multiple times in a row. Maybe we'll do ITO3. Actually, I'll just kick off multiple different types of alerts. So I'm going to clear the logs. I'm going to resolve my company name of my fake company of labmeinc.com, but instead of an L, it's a 1. So it's a DNS cousin domain attack, usually common with phishing. I'm also going to make a high amount of connections. So this will generate multiple alerts in the SIM system. This is going to bump me from normal to high risk, which in this demo just blocks all internet access. So here we go. We'll see it down here in a second. So again, in the FortiGate, all I'm really doing is tricks with address groups, but you could program this to do whatever you want. This is a proof of concept. In a production environment, I would get really creative with this. I like to do extra things around critical assets where an adversary might want to exfiltrate your data, gain access to it, whatever. You also can do this to the internet access. Usually if I'm implementing this, which, by the way, here we go, we saw, oh, that's where the alerts came out. In a second, it'll go back up to high. If I'm implementing this in production, you want to be a little bit careful in that you really don't want to make the end user's life miserable. So a lot of times I'll just do it up front, a nudge. Like initially deviation, maybe nothing happens, but once things start significantly happening, maybe I won't initially remove access, but I like to verify some level of human interaction, like re-entering a username and password. Because think about it even from this. Even if the adversary is using attacks like pass the hash, pass the token internally, they don't actually have your username and password. So if a web pop-up comes up to get to like SharePoint, and now you're requiring username and password, they don't have that. So it could actually stop the attack. Doesn't always work, but again, it's just different ways to adapt. So here we saw high risks, the system got bumped up, and then again, the script will eventually move it back to normal. So this is kind of cool. This is just a simple proof of concept, but you take this as far as you want. So this is the end of the Zero Trust Architecture video. We're going to have another one on a different topic next month and more to come soon. So if you have any questions, if you like this, reach out to us or HNA Security Solutions, and we're going to try to keep giving out these free videos because we want to help the community. So thank you for your time.